So Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, something stood out to me in the Washington Post's story on the death of former Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, who was killed tragically in a car accident last week. The article was largely fair until the last paragraph. Here's what it said. A Donald Trump supporter, Walorski voted against impeaching the president in 2021 for his role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which resulted in the deaths of 1 police officer and 4 others and injured more than 100 law enforcement officers. She also voted against confirming Democrat Joe Biden's victories in Arizona and Pennsylvania in the 2020 presidential election. The end. The last words of an article about this woman's life were literally 2020 presidential election. You could take a lot away from that, or maybe nothing at all, but to me, it's just a really sad statement on the class divide that is wrecking American politics. We've been stuck in this miserable holding pattern since January 6th, airing all of our tribal grievances that have developed after Donald Trump announced his run back in 2015 through this prism of the Capitol riot. We can't get out of it. Why? Well, because the trust is gone and nobody is earning it back. Nobody in politics will earn it back if the media doesn't force them to, and the media won't force the left to do that because half of them are complete partisans and the other half are totally blind to their own biases. So a dishonest media just perpetuates this vicious cycle. If they're unfair, bad people will exploit that to sow distrust for their own gain. That's what Donald Trump did by conflating a rigged election with a stolen one. He lost, but he's not entirely wrong. The system is too easily influenced and swayed by money. Journalists who cast themselves as the nonpartisan heroes of our political story largely care only about money and politics when that money is being spent by the right. This is just one example of why trust in the media hit another historic low this year, and the pattern repeats itself because journalists refuse to deal seriously with their class blind spots. The author of the Washington Post article on Walorski's passing was Eugene Scott. I do not know what Scott's bank account looks like, but he has degrees from UNC and Harvard and works for one of the most prestigious media outlets in the world. More importantly, he lives and works in Washington, D.C., which is also where he was born. In Washington, D.C., the college graduation rate is 58.5%. The median household income is more than $86,000 a year. It is one of the bluest cities in the country. Now compare that with Indiana's 2nd District, the one Walorski represented, the one she was born in and raised in. There, the college graduation rate is about 23%. The median household income is about $56,000 a year. Of course, the cost of living is much different, but that's a $30,000 gap with less than half the college graduation rate. Donald Trump won Walorski's district by about 20 points. President Joe Biden won Washington, D.C. with 93% of the vote. These are basically different planets. In Coming Apart, Charles Murray showed how our new elites have, quote, increasingly sorted themselves into hyper-wealthy and hyper-elite zip codes that he calls the super zips. These super zips are based on levels of education and income. Speaking of the major cities around which those super zips tend to be clustered, Murray wrote, quote, because running major institutions in this country usually means living near one of these cities, it works out that the nation's power elite does in fact live in a world that is far more culturally rarefied and isolated than the world of the power elite in 1960. The Washington Post in 2013 found, quote, the largest collection of super zips were here in the DC area. Responding to Murray's research back in 2013, one Cornell sociologist told the Post, quote, we ought to worry about what this means for society when kids who are the most advantaged don't grow up with much experience or understanding of how the other 95% live, particularly the bottom half. I think you can reverse that too. And a decade later, we're living with the consequences every single day. We talk a lot about trust in media generally, but we don't often talk about the class divide. More educated people tend to have more trust in the media, as Gallup has found. And according to Pew's numbers, they have also found, quote, U.S. adults with higher levels of education express greater trust in information from national news organizations than those with less education. And they also, by the way, express greater trust in information from national news organizations than those with less education. So just about everyone who works in the Washington Post newsroom has a college education and likely spends most of their time working and socializing with other people who have college educations. They almost all live in urban areas and rarely socialize with people in rural areas as well. So when they cover national politics, purportedly as neutral observers, they need to strenuously correct for these biases, just as rural, lower-income people would have to do if they were writing about why Barnard grads living in Brooklyn thought Russia rigged voting machines for Donald Trump in 2016. But rather than correcting for their biases, these journalists lecture and condescend to everyone else about their own ignorance from these powerful platforms. The FBI raid this week pretty much ensured we're stuck in this Trump holding pattern for the foreseeable future, going back and forth on the election and January 6th like it's Groundhog Day. Jackie Walorski represented a much less affluent district than Washington, D.C. None of this is to gloss over the salience of race or religion or other factors, but it is to say when a Harvard-educated Washington journalist and his editors feels it's necessary to include the Congresswoman's vote in certifying two states' electors in a report on her life and her tragic death, the implication here is that this is significant enough for inclusion. That implication is worth some of our consideration. Walorski's constituents may not have as much money or many college degrees, but they are right about the media. They have no reason to trust the media that led them into Iraq and Afghanistan, hyped up candidates and institutions that failed them in 2008, botched COVID, and misled them time and again, nearly all in one partisan direction. So when the one politician willing to accurately say the media is wrong about everything tells you they're wrong about the election, who the hell else are people going to trust? You basically have to spend hours doing research just to figure out whether one media report is credible and what the heck is actually happening. If you're not in a laptop class, you're not scrolling Twitter at work, you're probably busy. So this is obviously not about the paragraph at the end of Scott's story, not just about that. What he said was technically accurate, although I doubt he'd have the same paragraph at the end of a story like this for any of the House Democrats who voted against certifying electors from certain states back in 2016, and that's really the problem. Why is one decision more acceptable than the other? It really comes down to inequality. And downstream of income inequality, education inequality, is empathy inequality. Ryan, the paragraph in and of itself is not a totally big deal. I do think it represents this idea or this total almost misunderstanding that a lot of elite journalists have of why people come to these sorts of conclusions. And it does have to do with mistrust. And if you go out and talk to people that are outside some really powerful major cities, they talk about their distrust. And it's hard to say that they have any reason to not distrust all of these institutions. And so it seems to me that we're on entirely the wrong course as to addressing this problem. Instead, it seems like we're just making the problem worse, pouring gasoline on the fire every single week.
I mean, so I actually think that, yes, it was kind of untoward of the Washington Post to go into her vote on that measure in the memorial, partly because her vote didn't matter. Like she was part of a giant faction of Republicans who I think shamefully and even more shamefully because it happened right after the sacking of the Capitol, the riot in the Capitol. Voted not to certify Biden's election, but I don't necessarily think this is an example of a class distinction. I think it's not as if public wills and public understandings of politics and of ideas and of reality are just derived just from the ether. Like there are massive kind of coordinated propaganda campaigns on all sides that are, influencing what people think about particular issues. And, she, but more importantly, kind of Fox News and the entire kind of right-wing ecosystem, long after people like Bill Barr were saying this election was not stolen. Like we've looked into it, we've looked at it. He writes a letter. He's like, this election was, there's some fraud here and there, like in every election, but, Biden legitimately won this election. At that point, the kind of entire right-wing ecosystem decided that they were going to continue pushing forward, behind Trump and saying that, no, actually, Barr's wrong. The attorney general is wrong. Trump did win this. And so, yes, as a result of hearing that for months, then people in her district are going to think like, well, maybe there are questions, to be asked about this election, because from where they're getting their media, that's all that they're hearing. So then to justify her position on this, by the fact that her constituents believe it when she's part of the propaganda campaign that made her constituents believe it. I don't think that's a class question necessarily. I think that's just a question of our kind of broken and tribal politics.
So I think when Maxine Waters voted against certifying slates of electors from a handful of states in 2016, do I think Maxine Waters was doing that cynically? Actually, no. I think Maxine Waters is just like on that level and sort of actually shared sort of delusions about the slate of electors in that case. And I do think in the House of Representatives, where we have this whole group of people who technically should be representative, and that's why I have a hard time getting worked up about AOC or every little thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene tweets, because they're supposed to be representative of their constituents and their people. I think actually a lot of the Republicans who voted against specific slates of electors, so Pennsylvania, Arizona, whatever problems they had, I think actually a lot of them believed that in the same way their constituents believed it. So as opposed to this sort of cynical feedback loop, I'm not saying they all believed it, but as opposed to it being a cynical feedback loop, it's more representative of the distrust that people have, that when Bill Barr is coming out and writing his reports, people are still poking holes in that and saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? To even the point where you have people who are serving in Congress who see reasons to not vote to certify the electors. I think that just, to me, it speaks to how powerfully our institutions have lost credibility and lost trust, that it's not just, people whose jobs aren't in politics, who follow the news as much as they can and do it to be good citizens and good voters, might not have every little bit of information they need, but it's even people in Congress. So to me, I think it actually just speaks to the power of our institutional breakdown.
Yeah, and I did think it was wrong of the Democrats who voted against particular electors in 2016. I thought it was absurd that they continued pushing this idea that but for some Facebook ads from Russia, Clinton would have been the legally, lawfully elected president of the United States. And those are two kind of distinct things, because when it came to voting against the electors, it was a pretty small number of people, and there was no mob riot that went along with it. It was just I don't know how genuine it was, but it was seemed mostly to be pandering to voters back home, but without like a massive MSNBC, CNN push around taking down the on January 6, 2016 the kind of electoral college count. Without that coordinated effort over top of it, it petered out, and it was never an actual attempt. It was just we're gonna cast these votes. The attempt to kind of undermine the president came later through the Russiagate stuff. So I think that's the distinction. You had the kind of air cover of Fox News and other outlets leading into January 6, 2020, that then gave much more meaning to the votes that were cast. Particularly like I said, literally after there's broken glass and blood on the floor of the Capitol when they brought back up a lot of these votes, and people still cast their votes, which to me is a different character of vote at that point.
I think it's because I think if anything, it's because they really, actually many of them, not all of them, but many of them actually really truly believe it, in the same way that I think Hillary Clinton really truly believes if it weren't for Vladimir Putin, she would be president of the United States. Yeah, yes. and exactly.
She'd pass a lie detector test on that for sure. But 100%. I think also I think a lot of those Republicans really truly believed that they didn't have a choice, and that if they voted their conscience, let's say they did not believe it, that they would be ousted. Like Herrera Butler was thrown out just this week, that they would lose a primary.
Well, that was over impeachment, right? That was over
right,
the
impeachment
question.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, but Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when you look at the way both of them handled lost elections, I think it speaks to some really deep and profound things going into trust and institutions on both sides, and the media seems to me always to be making it worse. But I think we probably have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.